August 6, 1942. The aircraft carrier Shokaku sat anchored in Truck Lagoon, its flight deck empty, its hangar bays quiet. Below deck, in a cramped conference room thick with cigarette smoke, 5 Japanese naval officers sat around a table covered with maps, casualty reports, and intelligence summaries. They had been meeting for 3 hours. No one had spoken for the last 10 minutes. Finally, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi broke the silence. "Gentlemen, we need to acknowledge what these numbers are telling us. The war is lost." The room remained silent. No one contradicted him. No one had to. They all knew. August 6, 1942 marked exactly 2 months since the Battle of Midway, and the implications were finally becoming undeniable. Japan had lost the war's initiative, possibly forever. And the terrible irony was that Pearl Harbor, the attack that was supposed to cripple American naval power, had instead guaranteed Japan's eventual defeat. To understand how these admirals reached this devastating conclusion, we need to go back 8 months, to December 7, 1941. That morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carefully planned strike achieved tactical brilliance. Japanese aircraft sank or damaged 8 American battleships. They destroyed 188 aircraft. They killed 2,403 Americans. The attack was executed almost perfectly. Almost. The critical failures became apparent immediately to those paying attention. The American aircraft carriers weren't in port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea, untouched. The massive fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, containing millions of gallons of oil, weren't targeted. The submarine base was ignored. The repair facilities remained intact. Yamamoto himself reportedly said after the attack, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Many historians debate whether Yamamoto actually said those exact words, but Japanese naval intelligence documents from early 1942 showed that Japan's senior admirals understood they had a narrow window of opportunity. Intelligence estimates suggested Japan had 6 to 8 months before American industrial production would begin to overwhelm Japanese advantages in training, experience, and positioning. 8 months. By August 1942, that window had closed. The Battle of Midway in early June 1942 was the catastrophic turning point. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These weren't just ships. They were irreplaceable combat platforms crewed by irreplaceable pilots. Japan entered the war with 10 fleet carriers. By August 1942, they had 6, and 2 of those were damaged. The United States, meanwhile, was building carriers at a pace that stunned Japanese naval planners. In that conference room on August 6th, the admirals reviewed intelligence reports that revealed the true scope of the disaster. American shipyards had over a dozen fleet carriers under construction, Essex-class carriers, larger and more capable than anything Japan could build. The first ones would enter service in early 1943. By 1944, the United States would have numerical superiority so overwhelming, the Japanese defensive strategy would become impossible. But the carrier numbers were just the beginning. The intelligence reports detailed American aircraft production. In 1941, American factories produced approximately 19,000 military aircraft. Japanese factories produced about 5,000. But the gap was widening exponentially. American production was accelerating while Japanese production struggled to even maintain current levels. By 1943, intelligence estimates suggested the United States would produce 85,000 aircraft annually. Japan would produce perhaps 16,000 if everything went perfectly. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, was present at this August meeting. He had been wounded at Midway and was recovering, but his tactical expertise was needed for planning. Fuchida presented an analysis that devastated morale. Japanese naval aviation had begun the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. These men had trained for years. They were arguably the best carrier pilots in the world in December 1941. By August 1942, roughly 40% of them were dead. Killed at Coral Sea, Midway, and in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. The survivors were exhausted, flying multiple missions per day with inadequate rest. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training programs were producing maybe 100 new carrier-qualified pilots per month. And these new pilots had perhaps 200 hours of flight time, compared to the 800-plus hours the veterans had accumulated before the war. American pilot production told a different story. The United States was training thousands of pilots monthly. Their training wasn't as intensive initially, but the sheer numbers meant that American losses could be replaced rapidly. Japanese losses couldn't. Every experienced Japanese pilot lost was effectively irreplaceable. Fuchida calculated that at current attrition rates, Japan would run out of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, regardless of how many carriers they had. The submarine warfare numbers were equally grim. Japanese submarines had achieved minimal success despite sophisticated designs. They were used primarily for fleet support rather than commerce raiding. Meanwhile, American submarines were beginning to strangle Japanese merchant shipping. Japan's economy depended entirely on imports: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from multiple sources. All of it had to be shipped through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines. Admiral Yamaguchi presented shipping loss statistics. In January 1942, Japan lost 15 merchant ships. By June, they were losing 30 ships per month. By August, the rate had increased to 40 ships monthly. The trend line was terrifying. At this rate, by 1944, Japan wouldn't have enough merchant shipping to maintain basic economic function, much less support military operations. And Japan's shipbuilding capacity couldn't keep pace. They could build perhaps 200,000 tons of merchant shipping per year. They were losing 300,000 tons per year, and the losses were accelerating. The strategic situation was equally dire. Japan had conquered vast territories in 6 months: the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and numerous Pacific islands. This expansion created a defensive perimeter thousands of miles long. Defending it required dispersing Japanese forces across dozens of garrisons, many in isolated locations that were difficult to supply and impossible to reinforce quickly. The Americans, by contrast, could concentrate their forces. They could choose where and when to attack. Japan had to defend everywhere. This fundamental asymmetry meant that even with equal forces, the Americans had the advantage. But forces weren't equal. American strength was growing. Japanese strength was declining. The mathematics were inescapable. One admiral raised the possibility of negotiated peace. Perhaps if Japan proposed returning some conquered territories, the United States might agree to a ceasefire. The suggestion was met with bitter laughter. The admirals had all read the intelligent summaries of American public opinion. Pearl Harbor had enraged the American public in ways Japanese planners hadn't anticipated. The attack, meant to demoralize America into negotiating, had instead created absolute determination to destroy Japan completely. American bonds were oversubscribed. Factories were running 3 shifts. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. There would be no negotiated peace. America wanted unconditional surrender. The meeting turned to the question of what went wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor had achieved its tactical objectives, but strategically it had been catastrophic. Why? Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, offered his perspective. The attack had been designed to destroy American battleship power, giving Japan 6 months to consolidate its conquests before America could respond. The theory was that after 6 months of defeats, American public opinion would force the government to negotiate. This theory was revealed as fundamentally flawed. First, battleships weren't the decisive weapon. Carriers were. By missing the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, Japan had left America's most important naval assets untouched. Second, American public psychology had been completely misunderstood. The attack had unified American opinion in ways nothing else could. Third, Pearl Harbor had given America the moral high ground internationally, making it easier to build alliances and secure resources. Fourth, and perhaps most critically, the attack had been too successful in one specific way. It looked like treachery. Japanese diplomats were supposed to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack began. Due to decoding delays, the declaration was delivered after the attack started. This made Pearl Harbor appear as a sneak attack, a violation of international norms. American propaganda labeled it a day of infamy, and that label stuck. Japan had handed America a perfect rallying cry. Admiral Yamaguchi pulled out another document that made the situation even bleaker. It was an analysis of the Doolittle raid from April 1942. 16 American B-25 bombers had launched from the carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The physical damage was minimal, a few buildings destroyed, a handful of casualties, militarily insignificant. But strategically, the raid had been devastating to Japan. It shattered the myth of homeland invulnerability. It proved that American carriers could approach Japan itself. It forced Japan to keep aircraft and troops in the home islands for defense, resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Most importantly, it had prompted the Japanese High Command to accelerate plans for the Midway operation, the operation that had ended in catastrophic defeat. The Midway operation itself deserved examination. The plan had been complex, involving multiple forces approaching from different directions, meant to confuse and overwhelm American defenders. Instead, the complexity had created coordination problems. The Japanese forces were dispersed, unable to support each other. Meanwhile, American codebreakers had read Japanese communications and knew exactly where and when the attack would come. This brought up another critical failure: intelligence and security. Japanese naval codes were being read by the Americans. Japanese officers didn't know the full extent of the compromise, but they knew enough to be deeply worried. Every operation plan, every ship movement, every strategic intention was potentially known to the enemy before execution. Fighting a war when your opponent can read your orders is nearly impossible. The meeting examined alternatives that might have worked better than Pearl Harbor. What if Japan had not attacked the United States at all? What if they had only attacked British and Dutch colonial possessions in Southeast Asia? Would America have entered the war? The consensus was unclear. President Roosevelt clearly wanted to enter the war against Germany and Japan, but American public opinion in 1941 was deeply isolationist. Without Pearl Harbor, would Congress have declared war? Possibly not immediately. Japan might have gained months or even years to consolidate its conquests without American opposition. Instead, Pearl Harbor had given Roosevelt exactly what he needed: a united nation demanding war. Another alternative: what if Pearl Harbor attack had been more thorough? What if Nagumo had launched a third wave to destroy the fuel storage, repair facilities, and submarine base? Some officers had advocated for this at the time. Nagumo had refused, concerned about American counterattack and wanting to preserve his forces. In hindsight, this caution looked like a fatal error. Destroying those facilities might have delayed American Pacific operations by 6 months or more. 6 months that Japan desperately needed. But the admirals acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Even a more thorough Pearl Harbor attack wouldn't have changed the ultimate outcome. The fundamental problem wasn't tactical execution. It was strategic reality. Japan's economy was a fraction of America's size. Japan's industrial capacity was perhaps 1/10 of America's. Japan's oil production was essentially zero without imports. Japan's population was less than half of America's. In a protracted war of attrition, these disparities guaranteed defeat. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. He had opposed war with the United States
arguing that Japan couldn't win. He had been overruled by army leaders and civilian government officials who believed American democracy was weak and decadent, that Americans lacked the will to fight a long war, that a quick series of victories would force American capitulation. Every one of these assumptions was proving catastrophically wrong. Captain Fuchida presented the most depressing analysis of all: the oil situation. Japan's entire strategic calculus had been built around securing oil from the Dutch East Indies. American embargoes had threatened to strangle Japan's economy and military. Seizing the Indonesian oil fields was meant to solve this problem, and Japan had succeeded in capturing those fields mostly intact. But success created new problems. The oil had to be transported to Japan. Tankers had to make the journey through waters increasingly infested with American submarines. In January 1942, Japan had imported 400,000 tons of oil from the Indies. By August, imports had dropped to 250,000 tons. The trend was clear. By 1943, submarine warfare might cut oil imports to levels insufficient to maintain military operations. Japan would have oil fields, but no way to get the oil home. The admirals discussed whether there was any path to victory at this point. Perhaps if Japan could inflict enough casualties on American forces, make the cost of advancing so high that American public opinion turned against the war? This hope was systematically demolished by intelligence assessments. American casualty tolerance appeared much higher than Japanese planners had anticipated. The Bataan Death March and reports of Japanese treatment of prisoners had enraged American opinion, making the war personal. Americans weren't calculating costs and benefits. They wanted revenge. They wanted total victory. Casualty lists that might have discouraged other nations seemed only to strengthen American resolve. Moreover, American tactics were evolving to minimize casualties. American forces weren't engaging in suicidal banzai charges. They were using overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and material advantages to grind down Japanese positions while minimizing their own losses. The Americans were fighting an industrial war, treating it like a production problem to be solved through superior resources and logistics. The meeting examined the current situation in the Solomon Islands, where American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in early August. Japanese forces were fighting desperately to dislodge them. But the admirals recognized that Guadalcanal represented a new American strategy: seizing forward bases, building airfields, using those airfields to dominate surrounding areas, then advancing to the next target. It was methodical, grinding, and it worked. Japan couldn't match this approach. Japanese logistics were inadequate. Japanese industrial production couldn't provide enough aircraft, ships, and supplies to match American reinforcement rates. Every battle was becoming a battle of attrition, and Japan was losing the attrition calculus at every level. One final document was reviewed, an economic analysis prepared by the Finance Ministry. It projected Japanese economic capacity through 1945 under various scenarios. Even the most optimistic scenarios showed collapse by late 1944. Japan's economy simply couldn't sustain the war effort for more than 3 years total. They were now 8 months into the war. The clock was ticking. The admirals reached their devastating conclusion. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but a strategic catastrophe of the first magnitude. It had achieved nothing Japan needed while unifying and enraging the one opponent Japan absolutely needed to avoid fighting. The war was now unwinnable. The only question was how much destruction Japan would endure before accepting the inevitable. Admiral Yamaguchi proposed recommending to higher command that Japan seek peace negotiations immediately before the situation deteriorated further. The proposal was rejected. Not because the admirals disagreed with the analysis, but because they knew such recommendations would be ignored or worse, treated as defeatism and treason. The military government wasn't interested in reality. They were committed to fighting to the bitter end. The meeting concluded with no decisions, no recommendations, just shared understanding of the truth. Japan had lost the war on December 7, 1941. It just didn't know it yet. The admirals filed out, returning to their duties, planning operations they knew couldn't succeed, fighting a war they knew was lost. August 6, 1942. The day Japanese admirals knew with certainty that Pearl Harbor had been their nation's fatal mistake.